Hey, this is Dominic, and this is your home for the cutting-edge conversations on optimizing your personal performance, lighting up your sex life, and living a purpose-driven life of your own design.
These are the topics that Dominic and I have both struggled with in our own lives and still don't always get right. This is Brian. Welcome to the Great Man Podcast.
All right, well, welcome to week number 3 of the Building Your Best Self series, a 13-episode mini adventure to help you envision that next level that you plan to step into in 2022. Now, the first week, we tackled the 5 questions that every man needs to ask about his life. And last week, we explored one of the most crucial concepts in helping you find your next level, which is doing what gives you your greatest energy. Today's episode is week number 3, and it's all about mastering your relationship with time. There's absolutely no way that you can step into the next level, into your best self, unless you improve your relationship with how you navigate time. And specifically, something that's less discussed, which we're going to be talking about today, is exploring your present day time identity. What do we mean by time identity? Over the course of your life, you've developed a relationship with time that has forged this identity that you have with respect to time. For example, when you think about your relationship and your identity with time, do you have an empowering relationship with time? Do you have a love-hate relationship with time? Is time always slipping through your fingers? Are you militant and rigid with how you navigate time? Are you much more fluid and flowy? Are you wasteful with time? Do you have a self-critical relationship with how you manage time? To bring a new level of awareness to this time identity allows you to then ask yourself a more important question. How can I improve it? That's it. As you are stepping into this next level of what you want for your life, how you manage your time and how you see your own personal identity with respect to time is critical. So in today's episode, we're going to start with the theoretical and the mindset part of time. And we're going to finish the back half of the conversation with some real practical techniques and concepts and tactics to employ to help you manage your time and your calendar more effectively. So we're going to be talking about the single most important mindset shift that you need in order to own your time. And if you don't make this mindset shift, then all of the tactics, all of the concepts, all the time management systems will be rendered impotent because you will always have a scarce time relationship. Why priority management is so much more important than time management. We'll also give you 2 questions to ask yourself to interrupt overwhelm and chronically busy states of being and to take back command of your time. Why your greatest energy, which is a concept that we spent a lot of time talking about last week. Why the greatest energy is your linchpin to determining your priorities. We'll give you a process for chunking your time into 3 categories to help you think about it much more succinctly and clearly, and how to block and protect your calendar for the most important things that move the needle in your life. I know you'll enjoy this conversation today on becoming the master of your time. So, Bri, the other day, one of the boys from our men's group, Mark Krasner, was coming in from out of town. Haven't seen him in, months. And we're meeting up at 1 p.m. at Sweet Green, which is a great salad place that he loves. And I said, Mark, meet me at the Sweet Green, 1 p.m. on Astor Place here in New York City. And so the day comes, it's 1:01 p.m. and Mark isn't there. And I get a phone call from Mark and he said, DQ, I'm at the Sweet Green that I thought you told me to meet you at, but it's 1:01 p.m. It's 1 minute after the time you told me to meet and you're not here. So I knew something was wrong. I knew I was at the wrong Sweet Green. And it turns out he was the one at University Place, which is a couple blocks away. And what that made me realize in that moment, it made me laugh that like I have this brand, this identity of being like the time cop, right? The guy who's just like on time all the time. And that works to my favor sometimes. It can also make me rigid sometimes, but I saw you smile when I was telling that story. So what's coming up for you on that, bud?
Yeah, I've never received that phone call before. I've received that phone call 30 minutes after I'm supposed to be somewhere, but never 1 minute. Although I think that you and I, in our journey, in our process, you have become a little less rigid, but what's the word I'm looking for? Still in integrity.
Yeah.
Right? Like you're still going to be there on time, but less rigid. And I have become more on time, which I think is a good thing. I think this is a good thing, but that's not surprising that Mark called you.
Yeah, it leads into this conversation that we want to have today around exploring your identity with respect to time. This falls under the umbrella of the 13-week episode series that we're doing to help you build your best self, to step into that next level for 2022. And time is something that we all struggle with. And we should really ask the question, like, why is it such a universal struggle? We have to look at how we've built our identities over decades of our lives with our relationship with respect to time. So today we're going to be going over exploring the mindset you have with respect to time and also giving you specific tactics on how to shift that. First and foremost, identity. To understand identity, the root of the word identity comes from a couple Latin words that basically boil down to repeated state of being. So you are a certain way enough times, that becomes your identity. It doesn't necessarily mean that's who you are. It just means that you've been that way enough times that that's kind of how you've identified. And if you choose to maintain that unconsciously, then you will continue to have that relationship, let's say with respect to time, unconsciously into the future. What we're doing here is interrupting that to say, how would you like your relationship with time to be as you move into that best self version of you in 2022 and beyond? So we're going to be looking at the book, The Big Leap, written by Gay Hendricks, who's, one of the most sought after coaches, performance coaches in the world. He's coached Michael Dell and a number of other Fortune 50 CEOs. And in the book, he said that we all adopt personas with respect to time. Personas or identities. He said on one end of the spectrum, Bri, you have the time cops. The time cops are people who are meticulous with their time. They're on time. They expect everyone else to be on time. They get pissed off when people aren't on time. They can be dependable, reliable, trustworthy, but also rigid. I might fall into that category.
You and Jean-Claude Van Damme. We had to make the movie reference. I'm sorry. Continue with the identities. The Time Cop, great time-based movie.
Was that an 80s movie or a 90s movie? I didn't even think about it.
It is probably 90s-ish.
What happened to him, man? He was like a big celebrity for a while. Now he does like commercials where he just does splits.
He is known for the splits.
Yeah. All right. So the other end of the spectrum is the time slackers. And the time slackers are the one where time is really just being on time is just kind of a suggestion. You tend to take a lot of shit from other people for like kind of waltzing in late, but what's the big deal? Like, why is everyone so rigid with, but can't we just loosen up a little bit? Where might you fall on that spectrum?
Yeah, I'm the slacker for sure. As a matter of fact, as you were describing Time Cop, the image that came into my mind was a slip and slide. It's like, yeah, within a half hour, right? I have a good friend of mine, Nishant Roy, as you know. He's Indian, and he likes to call it Indian Standard Time. So if you're within an hour of when you're supposed to be there, you're actually on time. So,
yeah, and I think that's a great thing to bring in because culturally, what we've learned culturally, right, in the Indian culture and in Latin culture, in Italian culture, like there are different things that we have learned that have become a part of our identity that we didn't necessarily choose consciously. We can actually make a new choice around who we want to be with respect to time going forward. But here's the biggest unconscious aha that Gay Hendricks talks about in The Big Leap. We have all become time victims. This is the biggest identity that we have unconsciously taken on, is that we are victims of time. How do you know that you're a victim of time? Well, perhaps you say things like, time flies. Where did the time go? I'd really love to do that thing for myself, except I don't have time. I'd love to see my friends more. I don't have time. I'd love to deepen my relationship with my partner, but I don't have time. I'd love to get more strategic with my business, but I don't have time. I'd love to spend more time with my kids, but I don't have time. And over and over and over and over again. What are some of your complaints about time, Bri?
I think my first one is that's going to take too much time. Like, I can't go do this thing that I want to do because it's going to take too much time. I can't go get an education. I can't go build this thing. I can't go read this book, whatever it may be, because it's going to be just too much time.
Yeah.
That's a big one for me. Like how, like, where am I going to fit this big chunk in?
And that's predicated on a belief that there's not enough time.
Right.
If there's a time scarcity feeling, then you can make statements around that's going to take too much time. Therefore, I shouldn't allocate it.
That's certainly true. We can talk about the, like, well, is it that important, right? And the prioritization. But the second complaint I have is ironically the opposite of the first one, which is I vastly underestimate how much time something will take. And that is true anything from getting ready to go out and being like at the door 5 minutes late because the shower took longer. I let time slip by when I was getting ready, whatever it may be. But it's just like underestimating what something will actually take.
Yeah. And it's amazing that both of those things kind of are polar opposites, and yet you experience both of them on a regular basis, right?
Right.
A couple of my chief complaints about time are, up until recently, I used to say, I don't have any time for creativity. I don't have time to be creative. Creativity requires time and space, but my schedule is so busy. I have so many to-dos. I have 2 podcasts a week that we're recording and 2 emails a week and all of these things that need to get done, and therefore there's no space. But I set it up that way. I was the one who created all of those podcasts, all of those deliverables. I set it up that way. And so I'm kind of putting the cart before the horse here because we're getting to like a really key point here about why we end up as victims. But before we go there, another chief complaint I'd had is I don't have any free time on my weeknights. You know, Monday night we have men's group. Wednesday night I have the digital mastermind. Thursday night we have mastermind 1.0 and 2.0. And all of a sudden it's like none of my weeknights are free to just like kind of have dinner with friends or go out on dates or whatever. And I found myself complaining about that. I also set that up. I'm the one who chose those nights to do the men's group and to say yes to men's group and so what Gay Hendricks forces us to look at is why have we all just willingly assumed the position of being victims to time? Why do we allow ourselves to complain about the lack of time that we have, the scarcity of time that we have? And what he posits is the fact that we have become consumers and slaves to time versus masters of our own time. We are the ones who are at the mercy of time, not the CEO of the business that gets to choose how to allocate time.
Yeah, I mean, I think the complaints are very real. The victim mentality of like, oh, I have to be doing this, or this is the way things go. Like, it's very easy. We grew up in schools that told us where to be, when to be, and everything else. And so like, I feel like this shift of going from victim to master is not one that happens naturally, or even one that we have to, you know, even if it is on our own time, we have outside priorities. We have kids, we have houses to take care of, we have all these responsibilities. And so that's what comes up for me. It's like a wondering of how do we become masters of our time, even with all these outside forces?
Yeah. And the reason why we're talking about the mindset shift first is because there are tons of time systems that are out there, right? Like follow this formula. Here's how to structure your day. Here's how to get regimented with your time. Here's how to block your calendar. Some of those things work, but they oftentimes become too complex. They become too rigid. They become, hard to continue off into perpetuity. And
yeah, I mean, who hasn't implemented one of these techniques that we learned during a seminar at work or a friend told you about? I know I have. I've tried blocking out my entire days on Excel documents and be like, this is what I'm doing. And then things happen, right? It's like the best laid plans and they just don't work. So this mindset, I think, is probably even a more important thing than the how-tos.
That's right. Because if you still see yourself as a victim of time, as a consumer of time, as the indentured servant of time, and that you're in that subordinate position, it will render all these other time hacks and time systems impotent. You know what I mean? Because like you're the victim versus if you step into I'm the master of how I choose to allocate my time, there comes a responsibility with that. Just like stepping into the CEO position of a business, all of the business results, all of the culture of the business, like everything, all the PR about the business, the buck stops with you. And that's a huge responsibility. And most of us have a hard time taking that kind of responsibility around our time because that means if you're chronically busy, if you're chronically in a hurry, if you're not spending the kind of time you want with your significant other or being strategic about your business, It's because you set it up that way. And that's a tough pill to swallow, but you either swallow that pill or you swallow the pill of, I'm going to choose to be a victim for the rest of my life and indentured servant to time and its whims.
Okay, so we are victims of time. We want to become masters of time. I understand that in theory, but how does that work? How do we go from this shift of feeling like a victim and constantly complaining about time versus owning it?
Great. I'll talk to you about how I addressed one of my chief complaints, which was I have no time for creativity, right? That was the thing I mentioned before. I felt this burning desire to want to create more, but the way my life was set up, I had so many deliverables, so many things that I was responsible for producing that my days were just stacked up with one deadline, one to do after another. When I stepped into the CEO level position to say, I'm going to be the one who chooses to create time for creativity, what are the tough decisions I now need to make in order to free up the space for that? And so I started to look at my ecosystem of deliverables and I was like, wow, we're doing 2 podcasts a week. Wow, I'm writing 2 emails per week. Wow, every one of these masterminds I'm creating content for and then delivering that content, every one of these masterminds. And so I, as the CEO and the master of my time, decided we're going to do 1 podcast a week. I'm going to write 1 email a week. And I'm going to be looking for men in the masterminds to step up and run some of these Thursday night calls or Wednesday night calls so that instead of me creating and then delivering the content, I now have hours of additional free time. What ended up happening as a result of that is I created one big chunk of Monday morning free time. I call it my creative day. And it goes from like 7 a.m. till 12 noon. No one else gets access to me during that 5-hour chunk of time. So I'm in pure creation, which allows me to dream big about the business, the future of this work, some of the programs we're launching, and my Instagram, which is like a big network for people to find us. Some of my most creative posts have come out and I've grown my Instagram following by 2,500 people in the last 50 days, which, previously took me 18 months to do. It took me 50 days to do because I'm creating stuff that's resonating. But I had to step into my CEO position and look at my ecosystem and say, how did I end up here? What are the tough decisions I need to make so I could reallocate my time in a way that works for me?
So was it worth it? Was it worth giving up those other things or shifting your priorities to this creative space on Mondays?
1,000%. When I go to bed on Sunday night, I'm lit up knowing that I get to wake up in the morning and to move at a slower pace. Instead of like getting, shooting out of my bed in the morning, being like, here's 1,000 things that I have to do. And then just like rinsing and repeating that every single day. I get to wake up and do the breath work. I read a great book that gets me into state. I do my journaling morning pages. And then now I'm ready to just like let some of that creativity come. Those 5 hours feel incredible. And I carry that with me throughout the week. And now the work I'm producing has a greater potency. People feel it. And so my results are better now that I'm doing less.
So now that's after the fact. Was there any fear in giving up some of those things that you were doing and you had been doing for a long time?
Great question. Of course. Because, like I could be addicted or attached to, say, the stats for the podcast. And the stats go up every time we release a podcast. We get more downloads. When you're releasing 2 episodes a week, you get more downloads, which is, an indicator for other people, how popular your podcast is. So to give up on 1 podcast a week means the numbers are naturally going to go down. I had to come to grips with that to say in the short term, numbers are going to go down, but I'm reloading here because I know when I also have more time for creativity that we're going to be able to come up with better ideas for the podcast that's going to get more eyeballs on it. We're going to create better content. This is where the idea for having 13 weeks to get really focused attention on how to build your best self for 2022, that idea was birthed from having that creative time, and the feedback we're getting on these episodes so far is above and beyond what we were getting when we were kind of just giving a dose on one topic and another dose on another topic.
There may be some people listening to this that are like, that's great, Dominic, that you have the time capability, you're running your own business to give yourself a chunk on Mondays, right? But I work in a job and I have kids and I have like all these other responsibilities that I have to take care of. What do you say to that person listening?
Yeah. First of all, I empathize with the overwhelm. And I empathize with like the responsibility on your shoulders because I felt a lot of that in my life too. And you created that situation 100% with saying yes to being a partner in a relationship. Like you said consciously yes to being, and that requires time and energy and commitment. You said yes to taking on the job responsibilities. You said yes to having the kids. You said yes to whatever social engagements you said yes to. You are the one who created that life. And I don't say that to beat you over the head with it. I say that so you can recognize the power and the authority that you have over your life. And so if you think of yourself as a CEO of a business where the buck stops with you, right? You're responsible for all the income. You're responsible for the culture of the organization. You're responsible for how time gets allocated. Then if you don't like the results you're getting, if you don't like being in a hurry, if you don't like being overwhelmed, then it's time for you to make some tough decisions and to look at, okay, I no longer want to be burning the midnight oil, or I no longer want to feel anxious when I wake up in the bed in the morning. What are the conditions? What is the schedule that created that?
Yeah, something I liked about the story you told, Dom, was that it wasn't an immediate thing. You had to sit down, look at the activities and understand the activities that you were doing, decide what you're going to give up on and say like, hey, like I'm going to do one podcast, not two podcasts. I'm going to do one email, not two emails, right? And then you found ways to take care of those responsibilities or let them go so that you could create that space. And I think that's what we're talking about here is like, how do we go about creating the space?
Yes.
In my business, I do what we call a 30 every 30. It's a 30-minute check-in on just how are you doing? Like, well, it's not a status meeting. It's just how you doing? Are we moving the career in the right direction? What do you like to be doing? And that's one of my favorite questions. Like, what's going really well? What do you enjoy doing? My employee came to me recently and said, hey, Brian, like, I am crushing it in these areas. And I agreed. You are crushing it in those areas. And these other areas, like, they take me forever to do. And I didn't know that. I thought they were just doing a good job and they were doing all their job responsibilities and everything else. But now when I look at the activities that I have on our plate as a business, I know how to allocate those things that employee is really good at. Yeah. And I give more of those tasks. Those other tasks I take off and give to somebody else because there's other talents elsewhere. That, as a supervisor, as a manager, as a CEO, that was so helpful to have that kind of conversation with someone. So I say that because this can happen with any context. If you're in a job, if you're working in corporate, that's great. If you have kids, you're not getting rid of your kids anytime soon. But it will take a little bit of energy to figure out what are those activities that we can shift and how can I reallocate my resources, my time into my greatest energy.
Yes, exactly. Then that's the exclamation point there is you're talking about becoming expert in what gives you your greatest energy. And this ties back to the episode we did last week about that. Greatest energy are the things that when you're doing them, they light you up. They're nourishing. They feel mentally and emotionally and spiritually fulfilling. These are the things that like you're uniquely gifted at doing. You lose a track of time because like this is the stuff that you just enjoy doing. So few of us actually know what any of those things are that give us greatest energy because we're spending all of our time doing shit that drains us. And so like the big shift in becoming a CEO, becoming the master to time versus the slave is becoming expert in what are those things that light you up, that give you your energy. And Gay Hendricks talks about this in The Big Leap. You know, he calls it the zone of genius. He's like, listen, for the last 30 years of my life, since I made this mindset shift to being the master of my time, I've never been in a hurry. I've never in the last 30 years been in a place of being like lazy busy. And the reason for that is because he treats those things as mental illnesses, he says. Like if I'm in a hurry and I'm chronically busy, I treat that as I have a mental illness because I can then bring it back to, I have the choice to choose going to where I have my greatest energy.
I'm going to bring us out of time just for one moment because there's another thing that we can look at in our lives that's a little bit easier to track. That's our finances.
Yeah.
When I talked to Brad Barrett, so he's been a guest on the show before. He runs the Choose FI podcast, and he's an expert right, when it comes to spending and budgeting and everything else. The mind shift for him that he taught me was forget your budget. That sounds crazy. That's usually where people start. He said, forget your budget because what it really is a spending plan. It's like you get to spend your resources on the things that you actually want to spend it on.
Yes. Yeah.
And I said, great. Okay, cool. So I'm not budgeting, right? I am the master of my finances. I will instead spend it. I'll put my spending plan together. Then he said, now go back and look at the last 6 months of what you've spent things on. And there's software, Mint, and 100 other things that you can look and categorize things and see what you spend money on. When I did that, I realized that my identity around money, of like how I spent it, what was important to me, was different than how I was actually spending the money.
Yeah.
And I could feel that, right? If I went out for an expensive dinner, it felt not good paying the bill at the end of the night. Whereas now I have more awareness and consciousness around what our spending plan is, so that if we go spend a lot of money on a dinner, it can feel really good because we have it. Like, that's where I want to spend my greatest energy. So we can look at time in the exact same way and say, like, not how am I just going to consume time, but how do I want to use it?
That is an awesome analogy. It's exactly the same shift. When you're doing a budget, it can feel like scarcity. I have a finite amount of money, which you do, but it can feel like, I've got to pinch a penny here, pinch a penny there. It feels constrictive. It feels like deprivation, versus the shift that you took on, which was, no, like you have this money that you get to choose to allocate where you want, but you need to know how you've been allocating it. And like you just said, it didn't line up with what you said was most important to you, right? This ties back to one of the questions we asked a couple podcasts ago around, the 5 questions every man must ask about his life. Do you align your time with what you say is of most value to you? And most times what you say is of most value to you is not where you're spending your time. It's because there's something else that's actually more valuable to you. And, like we said before, what's most valuable for many of us is protecting our comfort, our safety. Like, this is what's familiar. I don't want to have to deal with the change. Man, I'm already overwhelmed. I'm already energy deficient. And this change is going to require another expenditure of energy. Gosh, but again, if you're the CEO of a business, the buck stops with you and there's no one else who's going to come in and save you. You have to be the one who makes that shift.
And flagging those feelings of overwhelm, of I don't have enough time, hearing the complaints in your head. Prior to this podcast, Dominic asked me to write down 3 complaints that I have about time. I had to think about it. It took me a little bit of time to think about what my complaints about time were. And then when I did it, I was like, oh, okay. Like these are truths of mine. So cool. That took a little bit of time. So that, I think that's the key, is the awareness of where am I feeling overwhelmed? Where do I feel like I'm wasting time? What are the complaints? And then saying, great, now I have a choice.
Great. And so we'll give one more example on the mindset side, and then we'll get into some specific tactics, because if you can really take on the master of your time, then these other tactics, practical things that you can use, they will start to take a deeper hold. And I found that personally for me and for others that I've worked on with this. So I gave you this example of, your fiance, who you love more than anyone in the world, has most likely come to you over the last, let's say, week or two, where she wants your time, she wants your attention, she wants your focus, and you're too busy for her. And you turn her away. Not right now. I'm too busy. I'm focused on something else. Can you get present to a time that may have happened over the last couple of weeks?
Sure. Yeah. It usually happens the other way around, but yes, I can get present to a moment where that happened.
Okay. And for our listeners, maybe you've done that with your kids. Maybe you've done that with an employee, a friend, or whatever, right? A parent. You're too busy. You turn them away. Even though you love them to death, you turn them away. Let's imagine, God forbid, 10 seconds later, Becca comes back. She's just sliced her hand open, trying to open an avocado, and she's bleeding. What's your initial reaction?
I would pass out. I would. I don't do well.
Not good with blood?
I don't do well with other people's blood. My blood's fine. Other people's blood's not great for me. Yeah, I would probably pass out.
Okay. So you pass out. Let's say you wake back up a moment later. What's your next reaction?
Call your dad. He's a doctor. No, I would take care of her. I would try to figure out how to make her feel better.
You would stop everything that you're doing. And the most important thing in the world in that moment would be to take care of her.
Right.
Okay. So what we're saying here is what causes the allocation of time is you deciding what's important.
Yes. I mean, that feels like a necessity.
Yeah. Because to you, you've chosen that, like, yeah, this is the person that I love. This is the person who's bleeding, who's hurting. I choose this is the most important thing. So whatever I was doing a moment ago, which I thought was previously the most important thing that I could be doing in that time because I just turned her away. I right now say that this is the most important thing. So has anything shifted with respect to how much time you have in the 10 seconds that elapsed between you turning her away and that avocado, like her slicing your hand open?
No, time has not changed. I just have this, I'm laughing because I have this funny image of my head of her slicing her hand open and me just looking from behind the computer like, you good? Okay, cool. Back,
like not wanting to deal with it?
Yeah, like how that would go over. But yes, no, time has not changed, of course.
Right. And so the example is given here because it's an extreme one, but the time hasn't changed. In that scenario, it's not that you don't have the time. What you're really saying is that what I'm doing right now is more important than you needing my attention. And you need to own that.
Yeah, it's like a constant prioritization, right? It's a constant, like, what's most important right now, like in this moment.
Yes. That's the bottom line of this whole entire mindset shift is you deciding moment by moment what your priority is. And I've found, like, when I'm a time victim, it's because there's some priority that I have not defined. Right. And my time and energy is scattered and then I fall into victim mode.
This is something that happens to me consistently throughout the day. I'll be working on something and I'll ask myself, like, is this what I should be doing? Because, like, Don, like, running your own business, there's 1,000 priorities going on. But I find myself sometimes doing the easiest thing. Sometimes doing, like, responding to the email, sometimes working some data in Excel, like, what have you. And it's like, yes, these are things that have to get done, but, like, is there a different way to do this? Or can somebody else do this, right? That is a constant question that's coming up.
So then the question behind that should be, what is the linchpin that helps me to determine how to prioritize? Is there one thing that helps me, like, point like a compass to how I make decisions around what's a priority and what's not? And the answer is the linchpin is your greatest energy. The things that give you your greatest energy, right? The things that you're uniquely gifted at, the skills that you possess that light you up, that, like, when you're doing them, time seems to slip away. When you are spending time and when you feel that energy in your body, that quickly determines what your priorities are. And if you don't have a strong sense of what that greatest energy is right now, chances are you're also feeling like out of control of your time.
This is an important point, Dominic, and it took me a while to figure out, to feel like what is my greatest energy. Like, it took some inner work, it took some slowing down, it took a little bit of time. That's an internal state that I can now feel. I've cultivated that internal state so I can feel like when am I in my greatest energy versus when am I not. There are some external ways to do this as well. As you know, like, I do the Hogan assessment, which is a personality assessment. There's other ones. There's strength finders. There's Enneagrams. There's 100 other ones out there that can also be an indicator, an external indicator to, like, where your greatest energies and your motives are at. And I've heard it described as this, like, when you're in your greatest energy, it's like you're on a 6-lane highway,
yes,
going at whatever speed you want to go. There's no friction. Like, you're just flying.
Yes.
Right. When you're not in your greatest energy, it's a traffic jam. You're still moving. You're still doing it. You're still going to get the job done. Maybe it's going to take a little longer. You can do it. You're still in a car, but it's just there's going to be grind to it. It's going to feel like there's a lot of resistance to it. Right. And so some of those activities that you were talking about, Dom, in your example of 2 podcasts, 2 emails, yada, 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 right? You could do it, and you were doing it, and you did it for a long time.
Yep.
But now you are feeling like, let's get on the 6-lane highway and fly.
Yeah.
That's what a greatest energy feels like.
It's a great analogy. And to get specific in the body, when I'm in that traffic jam, like, I feel my chest constrict. I feel my breathing shorten. I find my focus is very easily distracted. I'll start something, I'll get a few sentences down on paper, and then, like, I'll jump into my phone, and then I'll answer an email, and then I'll go check on social media. So I'm constantly skipping from one thing to the next. When I'm in flow, when I'm on that 6-lane highway, I'm fully engaged in the thing that I'm doing at that time. And there's nothing pulling me off course. I'm just cruising. So start to think about what that feels like for you. And then your game as the CEO is to make your choices based on, is this putting me on the 6-lane highway, or is this taking me on an off ramp that's putting me in the traffic jam? Thanks for that. That's a great analogy, Bri. So what do you say we get into a couple of quick, time systems, ways to think about your time now that you are the CEO of time? How do you dole it out? And then we'll bring this conversation to a close. One of the time systems that I learned was at Strategic Coach, which is an entrepreneurial coaching program for people to learn how to double their money, double their free time. And they chunk out time in 3 categories: focus time, buffer time, free time. Very simply, your focus time is anything that may be revenue generating, greatest energy type stuff, the thing that's most important for your business. If you're an artist, like this is your creative time. If you're a salesperson, you're out like selling, pounding the pavement. Your focus time is like the most important work for your deliverables. Buffer time is where you get to kind of like the logistical stuff. It's the emails. It's the stuff that you're competent at, things that kind of need to be done for the day-to-day operations of your business, but like they have to be done, but they don't necessarily lead to the bottom line. And then free time is where you do nothing business oriented. Free time is where you get to go fill your tank, where you get to go play, where you get to go explore, where you get to go spend time with your loved ones. And business doesn't come in and pollute that or contaminate that.
Question for you. Your Monday morning.
Yeah.
What is that? Does that fall into focus or into free?
That's a focus time for me.
Got it. Because it's business related, creation mode.
Yes. Yeah. Great question.
And then when do you have free time?
Free times are on my weekends. And then some nights, like, say the Tuesday night where I don't have any masterminds or men's work that we're running, like Tuesday nights, Friday nights, all day Saturday, all day Sunday are free time.
What about working out on Wednesdays? What does that fall into?
Working out?
Yeah.
Working out is more of like a buffer for me. Like it's critical, it's important, but it's not focusing on my business. You know what? Working out may fall more into my free time.
I don't know, dude. You keep posting those thirst trap photos on Instagram. I'd say it's part of your business.
You know what? Yeah.
If you haven't seen these photos yet, I'd say that's part of your work. Let's put that in the focus zone. All right. Moving on to the next activity.
Yeah. So let me ask you some of the questions back so that you can start to internalize this and maybe like help our listeners. What are some of the focus activities for you?
Strategy. So it takes me a chunk of time to put the forward-thinking strategy together for the business. I give myself very little time to do that, or I don't go back to it soon enough. We're like, oh, we did this a year and a half ago, right? But as you can imagine, in healthcare and COVID, that the world changes very quickly. So for me, giving myself some time to think about like, what's the way we should be doing this and where are we going with it is really important. It's something I love doing and something I hardly ever do.
Great. And that has the biggest impact on your business. And if we rewind tape to the example you gave last week where you were at one of your largest clients, checking in people, administratively who wanted to get, tested for COVID, sitting at the desk, chances are that doesn't fall into your focus time.
No, absolutely ridiculous that I'm doing that. Yes.
Right. Those would be buffer activities, like those are things that, the business needs to get done, but you don't need to be the one to do them. Right? Like that needs to be someone else's responsibility. And the more time you spend doing that, the more time your business suffers or that it stays in status quo.
That's exactly it.
Here's a practical example from someone who's in a corporate workspace. When I left Prudential, I was the sales manager for the eastern half of the country. The man who took over my job, Chris Stout, became one of my first coaching clients. And one of the things that he quickly found out moving from a salesperson into sales management is you just get pulled into a whole bunch of bullshit meetings. Everyone wants to get your perspective or get your guidance on something. And what he was finding was that he wasn't as available for the people who needed him the most, his salespeople. Like his salespeople needed him and his strategy to help them build their pipelines and to close deals. So what he ended up doing was he created a block on his calendar every day from 8 a.m. to noon, focus time, 4 hours, Monday through Friday, where nobody was able to schedule a meeting on his calendar except for his salespeople. And what ended up happening over the 90 days that he did that, they ended up having the largest addition to the pipeline. Like they had the biggest pipeline they'd ever had, including when I was there. So he completely crushed me in those 90 days because he prioritized it, which meant he had to deal with uncomfortable conversations from marketing, from operations, from others who were like, you're unavailable. I need your time. I need your perspective. He's like, great. It's just going to happen between 12 p.m. and 6 p.m. 8 to 12 are my salespeople. And, that became how he did it.
I love that. It's such a visceral example of setting those boundaries and saying, look, this is what this time is for. How, like what happens in that time is up to this as long as it meets the criteria. Love that. That's something that should be pretty easy to do.
Now you may be overwhelmed by like, holy, like that's a big move to make. You can step in a little bit at a time, right? Like you can start with, hey, I know that I need focus time, 2 hours or 1 hour or whatever, 90 minutes. You go into your calendar, you block it, you put it on there recurring, and then you protect it as if your life depended on it. Now, what ends up happening is things come up, whatever, and you may need to move it, let's say 20% of the time. If you find yourself moving it 50% of the time, then you're either relinquishing your CEO level status as the master of your time, or there's something about that time that you're not treating with the sacredness that it deserves. You're actually allowing someone else's claim on your time to be more important than that time. And that's something you're going to want to look at too. But start with putting that focus time on your calendar because, Bri, if you had 2 hours every week dedicated to strategy for the future of your business, and then you do that every week for a month, and you do that every month for a quarter, what might that make possible for your business?
A feeling that I often get is being behind. I didn't get all the things done. And I feel like I'm constantly behind trying to do the things. If I had that 2 hours working on the strategy, working on even some of the product, and I only focused on that time, I would feel like I'm ahead.
Yeah.
And that would make all the difference in the world. It would feel like, hey, we've got the direction. We've got the product moving in the right way. I would probably have more time to do those other things that I wouldn't be doing. But I think that's the biggest thing. I would move from this feeling of constantly being behind to ahead. Great.
So then let's use one more technique that'll help you with that, right? Another technique is really just a simple question. Now that I'm adding this 2 extra hours to every single week, what am I cutting? What am I stopping doing? Because when you say I'm going to dedicate something to a schedule that's already overflowing, you have to make space for it. So how am I going to make space for this? So what do you need to do to make space for these 2 hours per week?
I need to cut out how much time I'm spending in operations. I'm not good at it. I don't like it. But for some reason, I hang on to it as if I'm the only one that can do it.
Okay. Take it one step further then, right? So you're making space for that by taking that off your plate. But then who gets it? What's the next step beyond that? Who's going to do it?
Right. So I need to either hire someone or shift responsibilities around to take over those activities or build new processes that require less time.
Now that's going to require time to do too. You see how this works? There has to be this, I have the desire in the long term to have dedicated space for strategy every single week. In the short term, that's going to mean I have to roll up my sleeves a little bit and do the work to find someone else to take the operation stuff off my shoulders. So yeah, you may run at a time deficit. You may have to work longer hours to get that in place in the short term as you change over to this other thing. But then now all of a sudden, okay, now you've got a bigger percentage of your life operating from your greatest energy. So now you're going to be more emotionally, spiritually, financially fulfilled. And then after that has started to stabilize, you're going to look for what's the next 2 hour chunk, or the next day long chunk.
Yeah. So I'm not going to get my 2 hours tomorrow.
Right.
But I may have things to set up and get that 2 hours in 2 weeks.
Yep. Okay. Another tool, and this again is a question I mentioned before, is when you start to slip into time victim mode, where you start to feel overwhelmed and feel like you don't have enough time, or you find yourself, saying where's the time going? The question you want to ask, how am I complicit in creating this environment, right? How am I complicit in creating this environment? I forget the coach who shared that term, but it was on Tim Ferriss's podcast. And it was, how am I complicit in creating the conditions that I say I don't want? So when you find yourself in a lack of time, that's a great question to ask yourself. And one more challenge that I'll invite you to take is what Gay Hendricks talks about in The Big Leap, is taking an abstinence period from complaining about time. Try it for 24 hours where words do not leave your mouth that say, there's not enough time. Where did the time go? I wish I could do this if I had more time. All of those complaints, all of those things that put you into victim mode, try just for 24 hours to abstain from any of that language. And if you find it difficult and you find yourself, saying this stuff, it is indicative of an addiction, he calls it. And that is kind of a pretty good barometer for, wow, how deep am I into this, time identity victim mentality?
I like to be a real a-hole here sometimes when people tell me yeah, I don't have time for that right now. I'm like, cool. What's more important?
Yeah.
Like what? Like, it's not. It has nothing to do with time. It just has everything to do with priority or what we find is important or anything else. And so, like, I love diving into that and playing that like kind of prodding person of like, cool, like what's more important than this right now? It's funny, like seeing people process that. They're like, and then oftentimes this happens with my developers all the time. They're like, okay, well, we can't get to that until 2 weeks from now. I'm like, cool, like what's more important this week that we're doing?
Yeah.
They're like, well, then they have to go through the list. I'm like, actually, like those things aren't more important.
Exactly.
So our priorities are messed up. Like, let's bring it back.
That's a great example of how this even leads to better conversations, better communication with your team. It's always about prioritizing.
Mm-hmm.
So to wrap this up, the number one thing that we want to leave you with is answer the call to shift from being a time victim to being the master of time, the CEO of how you allocate your time, and the buck stops with you. And that becomes a game of how do I allocate in a way where I can spend more and more time in my greatest energy? That's going to mean making some difficult choices, shifting some things around that may require more time and energy in the short term, more uncomfortable situations, more tough conversations in the short term. But then things will start to shift so that you feel more in command. You feel more energy throughout the day. You become less of a victim. And then ultimately the game I'm playing is to end up where Gay Hendricks is, so that like I never feel like I'm in a hurry. I never feel like I'm busy, even though I'm going to be getting a gazillion things done, because if I spend 100% of my time in my greatest energy, that's that super, 6-lane super highway, then that is full alignment with my great man. And that's the game I'm playing. All right, fellas, if you're starting to feel the momentum of the conversations that we've had about really honing in on stepping into that next level of your life for 2022, this conversation today about time, last week's conversation about your greatest energy, the first week's conversation around the 5 questions you need to ask about the quality of your life, then I think you're really going to be interested in joining us for our very first masterclass on designing the next year of your life. And that masterclass is going to be happening on Wednesday, November 17th from 7 to 8:30 p.m. If you're interested in getting on the wait list for that, because we haven't had the registration go live, in the show notes, there's an email address, hello@DominicQ, that you can send an email to. And in the subject line, just put Masterclass Design 2022. I'll write that in the show notes. You can just copy and paste it. But let us know. We'll put you on the wait list. And as soon as the registration comes live, we will release the registration for that masterclass on how to design your 2022.